Bonsai is an aerial adventure course provider based in Grand Junction, Colorado.
We actually started like most outdoor companies do, with a few dudes and a dog working out of the back of a van. Now we have over 40 employees.
Sarah and I take wildly different approaches to business. She's stable, community-minded, reliable.
And he's the mad scientist. He's the dreamer, inventor, and innovator.
But it's really the whole crew that make the company thrive. They create experiences that put regular people in places they never thought they could get to.
Tens of thousands of people go on our courses every single year. Sharing our love of the outdoors with those people is truly the heart of why we do what we do.
Every property's got its secrets, but we get out there and listen to its whisper, and the design always finds its sustainable layout. We're continually innovating new components and designs. Blending our ideas with local machinists and fabricators has a huge positive effect. Saying we can do that is the easy part.
Figuring out how to do it is when the fun really starts.
We love raising our kids in Western Colorado where they have direct access to wild spaces. We stay here because we believe we can help lead our community to a sustainable and healthy recreation-based economy.
But at the end of the day, we get to put people in situations where they fall in love with the outdoors.
Working with a few of his friends. So with my flip phone, tiny laptop, and dial-up internet, and while my kiddos napped, I taught myself QuickBooks, payroll, insurance, and basically all the bare bones of a business out of the basement of our house. And I have my undergraduate degree in public policy and my graduate degree in education, so I am totally self-taught. I call myself an accidental entrepreneur, but after about a year of this, we moved to a different house with a larger basement, this time with 4 acres in the backyard so we could install a few test zip lines. We built a small R&D course in our backyard that helped us train new employees, but mostly my kids have enjoyed over the years. They're a lot bigger now, but this is when they were cute. I have 3 teenage boys in my house, 17, 15, and 13, and it's a whole new journey for me. But anyway, in 2008, our company was growing like crazy, so we did what any family business would do. We convinced other family members to join us. My husband, Thad, gave up his lifelong dream of flying airplanes to partner with us. Thad had some skills that we needed. He put himself through flight school working as a construction superintendent, and he also has an engineering degree. So when he joined us is when the company really started to grow. We took on some super ambitious projects, including the Boy Scouts of America Jamboree site in West Virginia, where we built 26 courses over 3 years. It still has the largest concentration of zip lines in the world. And it's really interesting. I don't know if anybody here is a Boy Scout, but the Jamboree is every 4 years, and 100,000 Boy Scouts show up at one site to rock climb and mountain bike and zip line and skeet shoot and camp and all of that. And, you know, it's like instant urbanism, like Burning Man for Boy Scouts, I swear. It's pretty crazy. So anyway, we also help write the legislation for the United States Forest Service's Summer Uses Bill, which was passed in 2014. I'm sure you all know about this. It expanded recreation opportunities in ski areas. And also at this time, we started developing, testing, and manufacturing our own components, like braking systems and trolleys. And we have helped the North American industry write regulations for safety and participant experiences, which they didn't really have before. And finally, we moved out of our basement office and we bought this old office building downtown because my husband thought it was really cool. He was like, this is cool, it's right near the train yard. Currently, we have 50 employees on the payroll, with 24 based at our headquarters in Grand Junction, and we're a turnkey operation. We do everything from concept design to engineering, installation, training, inspections, and maintenance, and component manufacturing. And we also have a myriad of products, one of them being the new Adventure Forest at the Children's Museum of Denver. We just finished that last year, and I don't know if you have been to the Children's Museum, but that's a pretty cool product. So during this time, when we're building and growing our company, like many new business owners, we kept our heads down. We worked hard to develop our business, create profitability, provide jobs. We spent a lot of time building relationships with local manufacturers like welders, metal workers, fabricators to develop our components. And we also connected with Colorado Mesa University to engage the workforce. But in 2015, when our company reached its 10-year mark, I started to really get engaged in my community beyond just my kids' schools. Just to paint a picture about the Grand Valley, like many rural areas in Colorado, we have historically had a tight grip on the extractive fossil fuels industry. For the entire history of our valley, extraction, which means natural gas, oil, shale oil, uranium, vanadium, and coal, I think I got them all, have been the primary economic driver in our community. While this has been a necessary legacy industry, the boom and bust cycle of extraction has taken a toll not only on our economy, but on the psychology of our community. Bust cycles create a sense of hopelessness in the community that even continue into boom cycles because we all have a sense that economic wealth is temporary. Also, this cycle devalues a college education because most 18-year-olds would choose to make 6 figures on an oil rig over years of student debt. In 2015, a group of local businesses created the Outdoor Recreation Coalition to encourage and educate local elected leadership to the important role that the outdoor recreation industry could play in diversifying our economy. I think because we had been so historically entrenched in the oil and gas industry, many electeds didn't take the outdoor rec industry seriously. We had to educate our community that the outdoor industry contributes more than $300 million locally to our economy, provides over 2,000 jobs. And the ORC is made up of business owners in the outdoor industry or supported by the outdoor industry. So manufacturers like myself and MRP and DT Swiss and Leitner Poma, also Powderhorn Mountain Resort and Bone Shaker Adventures, but also companies like Bin 707, the best restaurant in Grand Junction, or Hot Tomato Pizza, the best pizza place in Fruta, and also All Metals Welding. These are companies that have been really, they're growing because the outdoor industry is growing and people are relocating to our valley because of the quality of life. During the first year, the ORC worked on a recreational development on the Colorado River, and we worked on efforts to increase world-class mountain bike trails, as well as the recruitment of new businesses to the area. Within a short time span, the ORC accrued statewide recognition. We were the first coalition in the state, and when we connected with Luis Benitez, who was at the time director of the state of Colorado's Outdoor Recreation Industry Office, the ORC became an example of what could be done in rural communities to help struggling economies. But I would say the biggest thing that the ORC has done since our inception is what we call Operation Infiltration. We realized that the way to have influence and change the narrative about outdoor recreation as an economic driver was to get involved. We all took community board positions, created partnerships with Colorado Mesa University, which, by the way, has doubled in size over the last decade, mostly due to their promotion of the promotion of the access to the outdoors. And we engaged the city governments in Palisade, Fruta, and Grand Junction. We spent time talking to candidates that were running for local office. We helped the school district pass a much-needed mill and bond override for the first time since 2004. And we spent time educating our local leaders, even the biggest stick in the muds, about how the outdoor recreation industry is providing jobs and contracts for those welders, fabricators, and manufacturers that have traditionally worked for extractive fossil fuels. Slowly, the narrative that the outdoor industry is a fad or has low-paying jobs was debunked. Our community now overwhelmingly understands that the key to wealth is diversifying our economic drivers. Energy, tech, healthcare, and manufacturing jobs are all key to our economic vibrancy on the Western Slope, and all these industries have a workforce that demands access to recreation. The outdoor industry benefits all of us. After working within our community, we also created partnerships with our senators and our governor. We met with stakeholders in the state to garner support and eventually became an example of community collaboration. We had bipartisan support of our efforts to diversify our economy. So really quickly, I know I'm almost out of time, but I just need to touch on this. While in 2016, while the ORC was really taking a foothold on the community, Thad and I were approached by a developer who wanted to buy our building. Our Union Station building is actually one building out of 3 on the train rail in downtown Grand Junction, and the developer had just purchased the depot next door and had this grand vision for a mini Denver Union Station right in Grand Junction. And so once we heard his pitch, we knew that his vision for our community was totally in line with ours, so we sold him our building. So that began a search for a new home for us. At this point, being over a decade in business, Thad and I started dreaming up what we wanted for our headquarters office. Our ideal setup was to have offices, a manufacturing and equipment warehouse, and an R&D course all in the same place, because our R&D course is still in our backyard. We were incredibly inspired by communities that utilize their riverfront as an essential part of their community. So Thad does what he does best and started drawing. And this, by the way, is how everything is designed at Bonsai first, with paper and pencil and colored markers. A reminder that art is the foundation of innovation. Like many other rural communities, our riverfront has been long neglected and blighted. We are not like many other rural communities across the country, not just across the West. Populated with junkyards and abandoned equipment, an old uranium mill. When we don't utilize our rivers for recreation and education, people end up throwing trash in them, like old tires and washing machines, or worse, like mill tailings. So Thad and I thought that by developing the riverfront, we could really create a place that our citizens could be proud of and rally around. So we pitched it to the city, and luckily they were all in. And right here is the riverfront project at Las Colonias. Little history about this area: 115 acres piece of land was an old uranium mill dump site that was cleaned up in the 1980s by the Department of Energy and then gifted to the city of Grand Junction to make it into a city park. It had gone through several master plan iterations, but the city had yet to come up with the money to build just a recreational park. So our vision was to create a recreational park, but also a cutting-edge business park where businesses with an outdoor-centric workforce would want to locate. Riverfront at Las Colonias will have businesses, park space, an amphitheater, restaurants, and retail, and finally a whitewater park, giving citizens direct access to the Colorado River. Our building breaks ground at the end of this year, and the public will be able to zip line across the river in 2020. Also, this is in an opportunity zone, so whoever's out there that wants to invest. This development and the ORC's hard work to diversify the economy has paid off. Earlier this year, I testified before U.S. Congress about communities like ours that are transitioning from energy dependence to recreation, tourism, and renewables. This was a crazy experience. I'd love to talk further about that. But I'm happy to report that for the first time in the history of the Grand Valley, we're having steady economic growth that is not based in extractive fossil fuels boom cycle. It's amazing. The 2016 election taught us all that rural America has been left behind. While populated areas are growing and thriving, rural America has been suffering. This is especially true when you look at Denver and the Front Range compared to the rest of the state. As a society, we've inadvertently decimated rural America by creating incentives for businesses to thrive in these populated areas. Also, like Grand Junction, these rural areas have a long history of depending on one industry, and they don't have a backup plan for diversification. The irony is that in many of these communities, including ours, we have focused below the surface of the land to find economic prosperity when the economic wealth is right at our fingertips on the surface. It has been a true gift in my life watching my community transform in front of my eyes. 5 years ago, hopelessness and despair were pervasive in our valley. Our schools were falling apart. Over half of our kids were on free and reduced lunch. Our suicide rate was the highest in the state, and for almost a decade, Thad and I had conversation after conversation about relocating our company. But here's a shout out to my parents too, and our Midwest upbringing. They taught us to work hard, do our best, and just keep going. So when Thad and I were faced with an opportunity to be part of a community realizing the best version of itself, we jumped at the chance. Luckily, our community is filled with independent, strong-willed people, businesses, and families that mustered up the grit to reinvent itself. And we have gotten to be a part of that. And that means we're the lucky ones. Thank you.
I wish I could take credit for the different presentations that we've had so far. Where's Delaney? Delaney was talking about making sure that we had snapshots of different types of businesses involved, and from Matt talking about VistaBeam to Sarah's discussion about the outdoor industry. And Sarah, the connections between your company and the community and the people, really, really fantastic for you to share those details. Many thank yous for that. And the next presenter, we have a third type of company, which Delaney alluded to on the first panel, and that is from Ag Tech. And please help me welcome Kelly Cox from Widget.
This is a bit hard for me, but first off, I moved back to Western Colorado, actually having never really lived here. My father was drafted 2 weeks before I was born, and so I grew up in a lot of strange places and a lot of fun places. But one of the things I learned in traveling and working in a lot of places, a lot of those places were rural, all the way from rural Europe to the rural Mideast and the Far East. And when I started having children, my wife and I started having children, she asked me, why do we have to live where they keep trying to blow up our cars and stuff? And she said, you've always told me that your grandparents live in Delta, Colorado. So we immigrated back in 1990. And like a lot of the things that I had done, working at that time for the air defense industry, and all doing software, I came back and I was shocked because we bought some land, we did everything everybody told us, never having been here. And what I found out was I could communicate with my in-laws in Southern California from Pakistan better than I could communicate from Delta, Colorado. And I bought all this land and they said, you can have whatever you want. And what I found out was I couldn't even get a party line. And I had started a software company right before we moved back here. It was growing rapidly. I had clients all over the world, and I couldn't communicate. I couldn't fax. I couldn't dial up. I mean, talking about that WISP stuff earlier. So what I did, coming out of the communications industry in the air defense, is I bought some surplus military equipment. The employees I hired that were local and my family that was local, I set them up in 1990, pre-internet days. We all had internet across the whole Uncompahgre Valley. We were beyond dial-up. I had a private satellite link, and there was 5 people using that. And 2 years later, after trying to convince the city council that we should do something, like put fiber in down Main Street on both sides, and they said no, I went ahead and did it anyway. Because I couldn't get anything at a party line at my house, I had to rent a place on Main Street, which was easy because half of Main Street was empty. We've heard about that earlier today. I ended up running fiber over that next year down 5 blocks of that Main Street, only to those companies that were on Main Street that were still in business, that had heard what I was doing because they all went to the same church or the same coffee shop or something with my 5 employees that were local. And I ended up having private fiber in 91, 92 down one side of Main Street. And then I had, I think, 3 towers that covered most of the Uncompahgre Valley. 2 of those were just on tall fence posts. Because we had the Grand Mesa, which you heard about just previously here. Grand Mesa is a huge, just stick it on a fence post and you could cover half the valley. That business stayed very quiet for about 3 years. And then the county commissioners came and said, we are losing 3 of our bigger employers in Delta County. 2 of them are going to go to Grand Junction. 1 of them is moving to the Front Range because they can't communicate. And we heard you could do something. And in 24 hours, they'd given me access to a telephone pole on the top of one of the hills there. And all of a sudden, that internet became public. And 3 years later, I sold it to one of the largest wireless providers in the US now, Rise Broadband, just because all of a sudden I had 7 trucks and too many employees. And I still wanted to do software. And the primary reason we had gone to rural Colorado was to raise children and to relax a little bit. And that didn't happen. So because of that sell and because of an introduction, I started yet another company. After telling my wife I would settle down for a little while, I started another company and then licensed that software off and sold it and was trying to be quiet. And about that time, those boys that we had started raising started going to college. And that land we'd bought, the neighbors were 30,000 acres on one side and 7,000 acres on the other side. They were all commercial ranchers and farmers, row crops, cattle, and horses. And the neighbors wanted me to go out and still keep irrigating the land that my boys did just for ski money. And I tried it for about 2 weeks. And if you can picture a software geek in chacos, in shorts, telling his wife he'll be back in 15 minutes because he's going to go irrigate, and coming back 2 hours later covered in mud because he really didn't know what he was doing, and he didn't have irrigation boots, that was me. And I whined and I complained, and my wife kept saying, just get over it or sell it all. And the way I got over it was I cut up my boys' remote control pickup trucks, stole the radio out of their remote control airplane, and I created a widget that automated the gated pipe that's all over our neighborhood. And it was just because I was lazy. And I didn't want to get muddy. And I thought, you know, I used to do rocket science. You know, I worked for Hughes Aircraft. I mean, things happen when you push a button. And I was too cheap to go down to Grand Junction Pipe and see what they had, so I just built something. And thought, well, I need 480 of these little valves, and then I'm done. And I can relax again. And the 90-some-year-old neighbor with the 33,000 acres, his head gate's on the other side of my property. So he goes through on his horse a couple times a week, and he knocks on the door at 4 or 5 a.m., which is fairly normal. And he says, well, what's on your pipe? And I showed it to him, and he thought it was a great idea. And he said, build me a bunch. And I had to tell David, I said, David, I have a 1/4 mile of pipe. You have 17 miles of pipe. You know, and you've got hired hands. You send your hired hands over, I'll show them how to build these. It's really simple. It's mostly Ace Hardware Store parts and Legos. So, and so he didn't. Bless David's heart. David showed up a few weeks later with USDA, NRCS engineers, and a week after that, the Bureau of Reclamation. And at first I thought I was in trouble because you read the newspapers. Some guy in Wyoming's getting arrested because he cleaned out a stock pond and he touched the water. And I thought, oh boy, you know. These guys with suits and ties came to the door, and I thought, oh boy, you know. So I took them out and I showed them what I did, and they asked questions for about 2 hours. And they asked me why I did it. I said, because I'm cheap. And, you know, what are you doing with it? And I said, I don't have to pump water this way. That's how cheap I am. By doing this, all my water's free because I have springs that are above most of my irrigated land, but my water rights that I can pump are out of the creek at the bottom. I've got a year-round creek. So I told them all this, and I told them what I called it and how I programmed it. And basically, I had programmed it over those probably 4 weeks by then to not have any runoff. So I didn't run off any topsoil. I didn't run off any pesticides, fertilizers, and all that kind of stuff. It took no energy to run it. I was using a little solar panel. And it really was all cobbled together with, I had Legos in it, I had a Mindstorm robot controller in it, and some aspen wood to kind of hold the pieces together, and some baling wire, literally. And they got really excited about it, and they suggested that I make it more producible, and that I get together with the ag school experimental station over in Fruita, Colorado, and start doing some formal testing. And over the next couple of years, you know, the product got better and better. And at the end of that second year, they did a little white paper and said, you know, this is phenomenal. It saves roughly 70 to 75% of water, saves 90 to 95% of your energy costs. Battery change maybe every 10 to 12 years. And it saves 90% plus of labor. You don't have to go out at all. You can control, of course, there's an app for it. Because that's all I really do, is write apps. So after that, they said, you should go get a patent on this, and you should, you know, talk to the right kind of people, and go to the SBA, and they'll teach you how to run a business that's widgets, because all I knew how to do was develop software, design it, develop, sell it, and I'd done well with it. But to manufacture something, I didn't know what an injection molding machine was 8 years ago. I didn't know anything about all that. So I did what they all said. I went and paid some consultants. I went and hired some attorneys. And I didn't do what I thought and my wife thought I should do. The same thing I'd always done. Develop a product, software, get some clients paying it, expand it, and keep expanding it or sell it. I created a corporation, I did all this stuff, I spent a whole lot of money, and I didn't get anybody to invest in it. I spent a lot of money. And I know that maybe goes counter to especially what they're teaching at a school, but I paid someone to help me write this huge business plan, and later we turned it into a fire starter. So anyway, after a couple years, just finally, after almost 7 years of looking for investment to take it to build a factory on the western slope, put miners back to work, this is a model that's very close to going into production. It's solar powered, takes almost nothing to run it.
Panel, please come on down, and I'll turn it over to Stephanie Copeland. I think, Eric, we're going to get you. Are you mic'd right now?
I'm mic'd, yeah.
Okay, great. You on?
Andrew?
Hey, Erick, how are you?
Oh, good. How are you? How's it going?
Can you guys hear me? Okay, good. Thanks, everyone.
How are you, Paul?
It's just so cool to hear these different companies that have started and thrived, not in spite of being in a rural part of the state, but because they're in a rural part of the state. And I think just as a kind of as a preface to our panel, one of the reasons I think entrepreneurship in dispersed areas of the country, not just rural Colorado, but rural areas around the country, is so important, it is also because it's good for the communities, but the diversity of thought and the diversity of perspectives is so important to the innovation system and the ecology of the U.S. competitiveness and ability to thrive in a broader global mindset with innovation. We've had, over the past decade, fewer and fewer business starts with fewer and fewer people working in those business starts than we have in the last 40 years, meaning that, in fact, in this bubble, we might feel like the startup ecosystem has never been healthier, but that's not evidenced in the data, which is that more and more people are working for incumbent companies in fewer and fewer geographies. That's not a good thing for our society, for our culture, or frankly, for our innovation ecosystem. Mm-hmm. So I'm pretty psyched to hear all about this. And Delaney, it's great to hear all the work that you're doing and all the work that that everyone here is doing. And Sarah, it's like, make me laugh. It's fantastic. So a couple of reminders that I will be a good panel operator. So, reminder that if you have a question, please tweet it at hashtag Silicon Flatirons. We're going to be brief in our intros. We want to get right to the questions, and then I'm definitely going to leave 15 to 20 minutes of time open for questions. And I don't see Matt here anymore, so I'm going to have to pick on another student to make sure. First, oh, there you're over there. I got with the red hat. Yeah, I got you. Okay. And then and we'll go from there. The panel topic today is around urban-rural collaboration, and it may almost sound like an oxymoron, right? Because there are people that want to live in urban cores. There are people that really choose to live a life in more rural areas, from 500 people towns to 100,000 towns of 100,000 population. And that collaboration is something that we want to talk a little bit about, what the potential is, why we think it's important, and what we've done so far, and maybe what some of the possibilities are, and frankly, hopefully get some ideas from the audience as well. So I'm gonna kick it off and just kind of level setting for all of us. This may seem kind of like an obvious question, but what data points can we point to that illustrate higher density areas do better as startup communities? What data tells us that, and where do you see that? Jeff, I'm going to put this one to you. And what do all these communities have in common? Those communities where, theoretically they're more dense, they're doing better. What do they have in common that make that underlie that data?
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. It's a great question, and good afternoon. It's great to be here with everybody today.
Please also,
please
introduce yourself.
I'll introduce myself really briefly. So, Jeff Kraft, I work for the State of Colorado Office of Economic Development and International Trade, which is part of the governor's office, and I work on funding and incentives and programs that really touch all parts of the state, whether it's the Front Range or Greater Colorado. And I think the Stephanie sort of asked us to set the stage with some data to think about. And I think about the Copeland Foundation does a lot of great work with data. And Stephanie alluded to this earlier. I mean, there's really been, forget about urban versus rural for a second, but there's really been a long-term secular decline in startup density in the United States, going all the way back from the 70s. It's been a steady decline with some cyclical ups and downs. So that the startup density in the U.S. in terms of the percentage of businesses that are startup businesses defined by Kaufman is like half what it was in the 70s. So even though we hear so much about startups and unicorns and the ecosystems here in Denver and Boulder and other places, it's really just there's been this decline, and many forces are probably at work, which is a whole panel and a whole day in and of itself. But so there's been this general decline. There's also been a decline in the percent of non-metro area population. So which you could argue that's a pretty good proxy for rural, and rural really is sort of in the eye of the beholder. Some people would say Grand Junction is rural. Other people would say big cities like Grand Junction and Denver, if you're like a Trinidad. So that's in the eye of the beholder as well. But non-metro area population as a percentage of the United States has shrunk over that same period since the 1970s. And I would say right now, roughly 16% of the U.S. population is non-metro areas, but only something like 12% of the startups, right? So there's a 25% deficit in startup activity, even on a per capita basis. So, I mean, I think, and obviously this varies by geographies and densities, but it really is the metro areas that are generating the startups, generating the jobs, and have come out of the Great Recession. And now we're sort of looking back and thinking about the next recession and what that's going to do. But that was really brutal, particularly in many rural areas, and they were very slow to come out of the recession as well. So we're sort of stuck with those statistical facts, but lots of interesting ideas and sort of potential for hope and a new generation, I think, that's really interested in returning to some of their rural roots. So I think that there's some, even though there's these long-term trends, I think there's really some positive signs for hope that we've been talking about here today.
Yep. And Eric, for you, what kind of, when you think about entrepreneurial ecosystems, and I'll let you introduce yourself, you do a ton of work in kind of demystifying this, and especially for our rural communities. What are some of the key attributes of communities? We've talked a lot about this, that would then help us understand the context that doesn't exist in rural communities. Would you say attribute to a really robust ecosystem? I know we heard the external scale, network effect, et cetera. What are the things that you witness and you've seen that make up strong ecosystems.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks, Stephanie. Thrilled to be here. I'm a teacher over at the Leeds School of Business and lead our Entrepreneurship Center. And one of the most rewarding things we've done recently is a Rural Colorado workshop series where we're in every major geographic region in the state with a goal of really educating the local community to ultimately lead to business starts and business growth, which leads to job creation. So thrilled to provide kind of my perspective in that regard. And to your question, Stephanie, what are the key ingredients to kind of the startup ecosystem in the rural communities in my experience? And we've been doing this workshop series for about 5 years now. Again, just amazing work that we get to do. I'd say one is champions, right? The rural communities that really have a few champions in terms of innovative way of thinking and really want to take some risk and want to drive things forward. That's super important. And it doesn't have to be, it could be on the government side and on the business side, but just folks that are there in that community, rooted in that community, that are willing to take a leadership role. I'd say the second thing is education. A vibrant kind of ecosystem values the education piece of that. And you could probably say I'm a little biased as I'm a teacher, but looking at the communities that we've worked in that have excelled, versus ones that maybe haven't excelled as much, those that value education, whether that be kind of workshops or even online education, whatever that may be, I've seen really do well. We've talked about density, certainly an element of it. One of the key things we're trying to work on, and in a partnership with Startup Colorado, is how do we create bridges amongst these rural communities to create that density. And then lastly, I'd share in terms of kind of these strong startup ecosystems, and this is kind of an ambiguous one, but it's a culture. You walk in and you we were just in Norwood, Colorado last weekend, affected by the mines closing down at Cedra, Natarita, Nuclear. I'm sure we've talked about that today. But in Norwood, there's a culture of hope and of really looking to move forward. And so, some communities kind of have that more than others. So I'll pause there. But those are some elements that I've seen in rural communities that really drive towards, that much of a richer ecosystem.
Yeah, I think those are things that would be rooted in and would make up an ecosystem. And Paul, given the fact that all those things that really make a strong ecosystem strong sometimes are a stretch for places that are more remote. What's some of the struggle that's unique to rural areas? Again, against that backdrop of what creates a strong ecosystem, and what opportunities have rural communities missed because of it?
Thank you, Stephanie.
Absolutely.
Paul Major. I am with the Telluride Foundation. We're a community foundation that works in Southwest Colorado. But I think unique to this is we own and operate a business accelerator, a startup accelerator. I'm a general partner in a venture fund that's associated with the foundation, and then also we have a working capital loan fund. So all of these are about trying to create and support an entrepreneurial ecosystem in our service area. Telluride is very much like Boulder, elitist, got a lot of amenities, which is very different than the Nuclear, Natarita, and Norwood story, which is going through this, as Sarah talked about, this dramatic downturn because it's a resource-based economy. And we know where that story is going. So I think the question about what are they missing, density is clearly one of these items, but I think the more we get into this, we've done a disservice to two things. One is we've done a disservice about this concept of entrepreneurship, that you've got to be a certain type of person or background, or I hate to say it, education. Mm-hmm. That anybody can be an entrepreneur, as we just heard from our last speaker, and they may not look like that kid living in Silicon Valley that just came out of Stanford or a great school like CU. So we've done a disservice there on painting this picture for a lot of these communities that you have to be this entity, this person that has a whole, just comes from a different world. You can't be an entrepreneur, which contrasts with the reality that rural America is very innovative. again, from our last speaker, he just was trying to solve a problem. Sarah took an opportunity. So I think most of rural America is highly innovative and highly entrepreneurial, but we've cast this in this sort of spell of some kind of halo that you get if you go out to Silicon Valley or Austin or other places. I think the other disservice is we take the concept of access to capital and we have vanillized that, or we've sort of neutralized that. Access to capital is very complicated, and there is a lot of capital out there. The problem is we don't give these rural communities sort of the tools of how to navigate it. And I think because of, I think 40% of all community banks have closed since the recession, particularly in rural communities, and a lot of those banks have changed their banking practices, less around local business development, more about sort of mortgage lending and things like that. We really need to understand access to capital much better, or what I think we're calling now navigating capital. So I think those are kind of the two areas.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So let's talk about then, you know, rural communities, depending on whether you are 2 hours from a major metro area, or major university, major infrastructure, or you are 5 hours, will, you know, give you a different perspective on access to resources that you have. So, but in all events, kind of thematically, there aren't enough resources, there's not scale in many of these, most, if not all of these communities. So what are the real possibilities for, you know, rural and urban collaboration? How do you defrag? How do you, to use a communications term, how do you make density where it doesn't exist? And Sarah, I'm going to turn it over to you. When you are working with, and because you speak with and work with so many businesses in the Grand Valley and have become kind of an icon for, in a really powerful way, for what is possible, I think. You know, how open are many, and by the way, we talked about culture and how people are very culturally proud of, to own where they live and where they've grown up. How open are many of the people in this ecosystem and these businesses to collaborating with people they don't know and don't, you know, across different markets, including, and most importantly, the urban corridor?
So I think it's interesting, when a community is suffering economically, they're pretty open. And I mean, I hate to say it that way, like, oh, we're open because we're desperate, but I think that's, you know, at the time that we started this process of reinventing the Grand Valley, and I mean, it's been going on years. Like, this isn't just something that happened in 2015. It just got galvanized, to sort of use that overused word. But I do think culturally, I don't know if all of these rural communities, and I just came from the Outdoor Economy Conference in Asheville, North Carolina, where 15 states were represented, 750 people were there. They were all talking about how communities like Duluth, Minnesota, and Roanoke, Virginia, they're now focusing on their outdoor economy as really the base, the foundation for everything else, because everybody wants to move to places now that have a good quality of life and access to recreation. That's what the next generation workforce wants. And I'm not talking about millennials, I'm talking about the generation after millennials, like my kids. And so it's an interesting thing to watch, sort of everybody recreate themselves. I mean, this guy in Duluth was like, yeah, so they're right on this river, and they're also on Lake Superior, but they're right on this river that was so dirty 5 years ago that you could light a match and it would there would be fire on the river, you know? And so it's really interesting watching them clean it out and then get people, change the culture, because most people are like, don't go near the river, it's gross, you know? And so really unraveling 100 years of that sort of mentality. But I think the most important thing when any kind of investor or startup organization comes into a rural community is identifying that what's going to be right in Norwood is not necessarily going to be right in Grand Junction. And I think that's one of the things that we've done really well in the Grand Valley. Palisade is totally different culture than Fruita. And the Grand Valley is like, or Grand Junction is right in between. So Fruita has really made their mark with mountain biking. And they're okay being sort of a tourism-based, mountain bike-based community. Palisade had a huge, I mean, they just had a huge storm at city, or they call it town council because it's so small, but their town council just had a huge, I mean, there were hundreds of people in town council fighting this high-density development, this housing development that actually would have been kind of cool in Palisade. They don't want more people there. They want people passing through quietly, but they don't want a big high-density housing development. They want these old historic homes and a sleepy little town. So I think that's the most important thing, is really saying people, each community is going to want something different. Norwood is even going to want something different than Atarita. And so, anyway.
Let me ask, maybe I'll pitch this to Paul as well. I mean, when you are starting a business in, I think Brad Phelps says this, in his Startup Communities book is, when I was walking down the streets of Boulder, 20 years ago, I could pass an entrepreneur in every corner, and we all kind of drank beer together, and we reminisced, and we figured it out together. And when you don't have that kind of density of other people doing the same things, you have to import it somehow, right? Mm-hmm. You have to import it from an urban area or another rural area or another country. Paul, how open are these businesses that are growing, starting and growing up in areas that are less dense to, what I would call buddies and partners and mentors? And I know a guy that doesn't live in their backyard, that lives in Denver or New York or Silicon Valley.
I think people are totally open. We have obviously a lot of second homeowners in Telluride, and what's so interesting is working in this world between charity or philanthropy and actual capital and the markets is, most of my donors, they get up in the morning excited about entrepreneurship. This is what drove them in their life, yep. Right? So they're more interested in mentoring an entrepreneur than they are actually writing a check to charity, right. Which is just it's a huge resource. So I think as long as they're connected for the right reasons, and somebody said it, I think, early, or give first, which is the mantra of Techstars, is go in there not with the intent of making a deal or what's in it for me, but are you giving back to the community? And entrepreneurs are absolutely the driving force of any community, because they're going to create jobs, they're going to create businesses. So I think they're very open, but I do agree that it has to be culturally correct. We're culturally aligned, or frankly feasible. Don't pretend that Norwood's going to be some kind of software center. Mm-hmm. Yep. But it can pivot from oil and gas and uranium and coal mining and coal-fired power plant to a recreation and tourism economy. It not only can, it has to.
Right.
So
I guess what I'm hearing both of you say is that as long as the people that we're trying to bring together are in it for the right reasons and are in it with trust and alignment and non-extractive, sorry, pardon the pun, a very kind of giving way, then people are very open to not necessarily having to trust someone that's outside of their church community or their school, their school community, or their neighbor. Eric, go ahead.
And if I could just add to that thread, what's been really fun to see, the term that comes to mind as we go into our rural communities, the term is unleash. When we go into a community, it's there. They're innovative, like you're saying. I mean, and they want to do stuff, and there's activity, and they're hungry to learn, and they're hungry to take action. But it's almost like we're giving them permission to unleash taking this action. And this just happened again last week, where there were a couple dozen people in the Norwood area, and within a week it's a town of 500, and a lot of people in that room didn't know each other in Norwood. Mm-hmm. Like, I didn't know you wanted to start that business. Mm-hmm. That's fantastic. Oh, you wanted to start that business? Let's get together and drink a beer and talk about how we can support each other. I was blown away by kind of that mentality. So it's this sense of, can we just simply unleash some of these communities to shift their culture, to be more innovative? And it can be as simple as, like, let's get together, kind of like a meetup. Let's get together once a month, yep. And just talk about how we can support each other. And step one was they weren't even aware that there were people in their own community that wanted to start a mountain biking oasis. We had a a curated children's book that wanted to be created. We had a youth empowerment program. We had all these creative ideas, and their own community, wasn't even aware of that.
I
So-
would totally echo that. That's exactly what I was going to say before you started talking. I mean, there are so many entrepreneurs that keep their heads down and their doors closed because they're working on their idea. And so, I mean, for 10 years, nobody in my community knew about my business except for my friends, because it's not like locally we're installing a bunch of zip lines, So we worked all over the world, and people were like, what is that company? We didn't join the Chamber of Commerce or anything. We were just busy doing our thing. So, I would say the same thing, like right when we started to really galvanize all these outdoor recreation manufacturers, there was also this incredible growth in the tech sector. And now there's an incredible amount of growth in the green tech sector. And so just watching that, it's almost like you give people permission, you unleash. It's exactly, then you're like, oh my gosh, I found my people. Right. I mean, it took me really 10 years to find my people in Grand Junction.
The thing that I think about, when we started Startup Colorado 2.0, the rural Startup Colorado system, Sarah, I think you were in one of the first meetings. We were sitting in your office, right? We were upstairs at Bonsai, and
oh yeah,
I remember. I was in shock, mostly because we were there. We're with the government. We're here to help, and I can't imagine why they weren't like, come on in. I had this notion that, oh my gosh, we're going to be doing all this great stuff, and we're going to help. I want to connect this person to Brad Bernthal, and I want to connect Brad Fell to this person, and I want Steve Halstead to come out here and connect to this person, and all the reception that we got was, what the F do you want? What are you doing here? We got it. Don't come in. And then the other thing was, and if you are going to come in, you're going to sign a memorandum of understanding of which swim lane you're going to operate in, because we already have people doing what you do, and we're very protective of it.
Yeah.
So
very territorial.
Very territorial, and that was my better, got to retry this, and I guess the reason I asked the question was a little bit of bruising around that for my own thing, is how open are people. But I think the important lesson is that we want the rural parts of the country to both be a place that all of you and I want to live and work, but also that we want to thrive, not because it's our own backyard, but because it's big for our collective whole. And if we're going to do that, then we have to approach these communities in a way that is very much aligned with what they want, and very clear that the intention is supportive, and in no way attribution, and in no way extractive, right? It's not about trying to take things out, it's trying to give to them. Because you can, it's really interesting, like your second homeowners, think about, that's what they want to do. So if anyone wants to go into a city and you need lessons on what not to do, let me know. I'm here. So let's pivot for just a second. Paul, what are some key areas that you think could be really formalized? And again, you don't want to make this rigid, but what are some things that you could formalize that would create a virtual network effect for the swath of entrepreneurial communities we have in Colorado?
The state does a really good job and this is typical government. Government works very well with government. So the state comes and works with local, right? Sorry, just to reinforce what you said. They come to local government and they go, we can help your sewer and water and sometimes your broadband. But no, they're very good at working. The state works very well. But also the state has a lot of resources for businesses, and we haven't really figured out, I think, for rural Colorado how to navigate that. So I think about, if unleashing all these entrepreneurs is what we're trying to do, which we think we can do, they need to navigate capital. And so how can the state bring technical assistance to really navigate, whether it's the banking system, whether it's equity, whether it's whatever it is, because there's plenty of capital. But I think the state could bring another level of sophistication with a lot of other parties of how do we go to Norwood, follow up with all of these entrepreneurs to help them navigate access to investments.
Okay. And what about, and anyone can answer this, what about like a formalized, could you formalize a connectivity network of mentors. Could you formalize? I would love to get your thoughts on that and whether that's possible. And Delaney, you're not allowed to contribute. But could we? Is that something that you can formalize, or does it have to happen organically?
Well, I think just briefly, I think mentors are tougher if they're not local because there is a trust factor or there's some, some belonging there, whatever that means. But I think the network effect, we underestimate how important that is.
Right.
Because if you're in Boulder and you're in the food sector, you can get immediate access to anything to do with food, to expand, manufacture, distribution, whatever it is. And that's very hard if you're in the Palisade Valley, is to figure out where that network is of distribution, whatever it is. So I think some kind of, and this I think is where Startup Colorado is working towards, is building that network. That network effect, I think, is undervalued or underappreciated in rural communities.
So more resource kind of aggregation than mentorship facilitation, which can be more odd. Go ahead, Eric.
I think I would add, it's become more complicated than I thought it would be as I kind of think of that question. There's a number of layers. So one layer is, some of these communities are competitive, and there aren't bridges between, these communities. So, it's been like pulling teeth to try and get, Trinidad to work with La Junta, to work with, Lamar, these kinds of scenarios. So one layer is the local mentoring, peer mentoring. So I think that's kind of where we can start. Within Trinidad or within Orwood or whatever, they can connect and kind of feel safe, so to speak, in that area. The next layer then is outside of their geographic community, how do they get mentoring and best practices? Ideally, again, that would be within a closer geography to physically meet. And then there's technology, right? Another layer is, can we leverage technology to create mentoring channels, such as Facebook groups or whatever that may be. But there's different layers at each one of these communities. Rather than like, here's a mentoring program, just do it. Similar to what Sarah was mentioning, I mean, each community is going to be a little bit different in how we kind of implement that. Got it.
Jeff, the state, as Paul mentioned, there's a lot of public capital available, and a lot of times the public capital has been really generous in saying, we'll take a first loss position, we'll take a really high risk position in different areas. Can you talk about some of the rural programs that the state has developed that is meant to bridge that gap, and some of the ways you guys are thinking about it?
Sure. I mean, one of the things that the state does when it's providing capital in many, many cases, and this is a reflection of what Paul was saying, is we try and work through third parties, through nonprofits, through locally based organizations, and provide that capital to local decision makers who can decide if it's a good investment or a good risk. And so really the state often does not directly deploy capital. We might work through revolving loan funds that are scattered throughout the state, or we might work through nonprofit lenders like community development financial institutions. And so the state will take either federal funds that come in through a federal agency like Housing and Urban Development, which doesn't just provide rural funding but also provides funding to urban areas, or through state funds, and seed microloans at nonprofit lenders and revolving loan funds. The state's also playing around with some of our other incentives. You probably read fairly often, and everybody knows that there's a lot of Bay Area companies that are coming into the Front Range and establishing bases of operations here. One of the things that we're trying to do these days is we're saying, if you will allow your workers, you're coming into the Front Range most likely, but if you will allow some of your workers to work in rural areas, we will provide an extra incentive to you to grow those jobs in rural areas, whether they be working in a co-working location, a second office, or even at home. And we think, I mean, an interesting thing, I'm going to diverge a little bit, but a really interesting thing I've got my eye on these days, and I don't know if it's just anecdotes or if it could turn into a trend. And Colorado's a little bit of a different state because we have a large net population inflow. Some states have outflows or are neutral. But because we have this ongoing inflow and the Front Range is really starting to feel quite crowded, there's a strong consideration, I would say, where people who are part of a rural diaspora are thinking about going back home. They're thinking about raising their family, in a rural area. They're thinking, I came to Colorado because I want to get on a mountain bike and I want to pedal off really easily and quickly and not be confronted with 500 other people in front of me. so maybe I can get that in a rural area. So I think there's a lot of people that are really thinking about leaving the Front Range either to restore their family ties, to raise their kids, or just to have a different lifestyle. So I think there's this tremendous opportunity, and hopefully the state can work to sort of support that, for some areas that have lost population and haven't had the new ideas like you've seen from some of the entrepreneurs who are of a younger generation. I think there's a chance that that can start to diffuse out and really naturally catalyze diverse economies in rural Colorado.
So I'm going to put you on the spot for a second to ask you a question that you may not want to answer, but what hasn't worked? Like, what are some of the programs that you've been racking your brains thinking about what you're trying to do? What hasn't worked?
Rural Jumpstart.
Is that?
Rural Jumpstart hasn't worked. 5 companies.
Well, that,
or something.
Is that a program?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's times, I mean, it's interesting. Rural Jumpstart, I'll just give a very quick synopsis. It's a program that gives tax advantages to rural businesses that have partnerships with higher education institutions and that don't compete with an existing business in Colorado.
That's the key.
And
the non-compete clause is the key.
And when that program was developed, it's been 5 years ago now, we were still coming out of the Great Recession, and to be frank, businesses in the Front Range said, we don't want you to subsidize a business in Grand Junction or another eligible community that's going to compete with a Front Range business. We're scared of that. And so I think the Front Range is so successful now that there's a willingness to relax some of those kinds of...
And they're rewriting. I mean, you're rewriting it.
Yeah, I mean, it's about to expire, so we'll have a chance to do it over again. But yeah, so I think sometimes there's like a defensiveness, and that one part of the state is worried about losing an advantage to another part of the state. We have a venture capital authority at the state that makes venture capital investments, and the first set of and it's required to make a series of urban, rural, and statewide investments. And the first few funds that we invested in did a great job and invested in some amazing businesses in the Front Range. But those same businesses those same funds that were based here in Boulder had a harder job understanding rural opportunities, right? So if you're a venture fund based in Boulder trying to invest in rural opportunities and you're not living, breathing, and really deeply understanding, rural economies, rural values, and rural culture, you're probably not going to succeed in making those types of investments successfully in rural areas. So I think definitely partnerships with people that are embedded in rural communities and really understand the nuances and the economy in a really deep and profound way, and sort of how to get to that. I think those are all really important kind of dimensions.
And I would just add, anytime there's friction for capital, it means there's going to be less flow of capital. And so to Jeff's point before about working with third parties, I would argue the state should be the direct entity in a lot of these investment opportunities. Because when you go into third parties, you're adding friction to that capital in one form or the other. There's another layer of cost, there's another layer of whatever it is that goes with that. So unlike the government programs that you run around, expanding sewers and waters and things like that, where you're a direct actor in those programs with local governments, I think the state should be a direct actor with entrepreneurs and investing. It reduces the friction.
Let's debate this
I'll
one.
respond. It's an interesting idea, and I think it'd be possible to build an expertise within the state to do some of the work that Paul is describing. The classic challenge in Colorado is, our state budget is so constrained that it's hard to get some of those new ideas off the ground. That's one of the challenges. But I think, having training and getting some state employees trained up and understanding these nuances and these capital could be an interesting tool.
Yeah, what were you going to say?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I always like to touch on when we talk about rural economic development is I think a lot of people focus on the barriers to get into rural economies. Your schools aren't as well funded, that you don't have the manufacturing sort of infrastructure, you don't have rural broadband, you don't have the mentoring community, you don't have, the workforce. But it's interesting to watch what's happening across the country, because I think now we've reached this tipping point, and I'm just going to use Colorado as an example, where your urban areas, everywhere from Fort Collins, the entire I-25 corridor to Colorado Springs, has taken away some of the reason why people have relocated here. I mean, the reason why people move their businesses here from Ohio or come here to take a job from Michigan or Kansas is because they want access to the outdoors. They want to ski. They want to ride their bikes. They want to hike. That's why they come. I mean, I would say overwhelmingly. Maybe not everybody, but overwhelmingly. That's why people come to Colorado. And so it's in a place like the San Luis Valley or in a place like the Grand Valley, you can ski and ride your bike and paddle the river all in the same day if you want, with no lines and no traffic and no people. And that sort of Colorado you were promised when you moved here is a real compelling reason why, especially in this state, there should be more economic development in those areas. And so I think maybe focusing on the opportunities, the low cost of living, the fact that you can be a big fish in a small pond, the fact that you can be a really integral part of your community. I mean, I tell my boys this all the time when they're like, oh, you're leaving again? I'm like, yeah, I'm going to speak, blah, blah, blah. They're like, you're famous. Well, my 17-year-old doesn't say that to me anymore, but I'm like, well, I would just be nobody if I lived on the Front Range. I'm just another business owner with 50 employees. Like, that's not that big of a deal. But because I live in this community, I'm a big fish in a small pond. And there's something like really powerful about that, being an agent of change. And so anyway, I just always like to touch on like the opportunities, like the glory behind the rural experience as a business owner, as a parent. I mean, I can guarantee you my boys are not getting any, like even close to the education they'd get in Cherry Creek. But they're also having an experience with kids that will never go to college and some that will never even graduate high school. And so there's this real push-pull of like, well, what is the opportunity? Maybe it's okay. Maybe the opportunity, this downside is sort of also our best quality.
So let's, first of all, I have a little tear in my eye.
Oh, stop it.
It's so funny, I grew up in a really small town in Illinois, and I'm pretty sure I did not get the best education. Right. But I did know a lot of people that didn't go to college. Let's go back to kind of the theme of this panel, which is this collaboration. And one thing I would say, and Brad's going to keep me on script here because this really is the theme of the panel, is how do we really formalize connections that make this state feel like a community and not feel like individual communities are isolated from each other? And I think about what Erick's mentioned around education and Paul's mentioned around kind of the network effect and collaboration, and how Jeff and team are thinking about the broad programs that at the government that the state level government can play. Let me ask this to Erick, and let me see if I can get my thoughts together. But if you're an entrepreneur and you wanted to think of yourself as part of a 5.6 million person community versus an 1,800 person community, what would be the biggest ties you would want to forge? Would it be ties to education around capital navigation? Would it be ties to people that understand supply chain management? Would it be ties to people that have just taken risk, in a similar way? What kind of ties would you want to form such that, again, all of our communities in the state felt very connected to each other, such that it didn't matter where you started your business?
That's a really interesting question.
Really easy question for you, Erick.
So just tee it up, yeah. I got it figured out. Yeah. I think it's a really interesting question. I think when you first started asking that question, what came to mind time and again was community. So I think we start with the fact that we are a community as a state versus the competitiveness or, it's a threat in the Front Range if we do this or that, right? And I think the translation there, I guess I've used this word quite a bit, but it's really focusing on the culture and the communications thereof, that it is, not a threatening type environment, but a collaborative environment, that they're actually, when we build these bridges and we collaborate, high tide raises all boats. And I think it's a very fundamental kind of, thing to think about, but I think it's super important. And it's not an easy thing to fix, but and I've heard a lot of conversations in rural communities where there's this kind of threat, competitive type scenario with other communities. We just got to get over that. And I don't have the answer. I don't know how to do that per se. We're trying to help via the education piece. Like, we're all just learning how to create value from nothing, and we want to learn how to stay in this beautiful place that we love to live. But I'll pause there. I think if we can focus as a starting point in creating community, as an example, we have folks that go up to the Front Range and vice versa. And there's a willingness to meet people halfway versus this sense of, well, they got to come to me, or vice versa. I mean, there's got to be this sense of excitement to want to create these creative collisions by creating this community.
So is rural-urban collaboration really is it possible? I mean, at an institutional way, is it possible in a, and when I say rural-urban, I'm overgeneralizing, but I think, like, if I'm talking to someone in Manhattan, they're not thinking a lot about upstate New York, How do we get the urban areas to think more about, again, rising all tides? And is it possible to institutionalize this collaboration? What do you think, Paul?
Well, one way to just simplify this is, if you're in Norwood and you're got a product, you need access to markets. You need distribution, right? You've got to sell the product to somebody. And so what can we do to get that product to Grand Junction, that product to Durango, that product to Denver? And that's that network effect. Okay. Because to get into those markets, and this is a way to simplify this, whether it's a product or a service, you're trying to get to markets and you're trying to sell to customers. Right. So that the more density you have, the more customers you have. So ultimately, at some critical mass, these rural companies need to get to those markets. So that's one way to simplify this.
And what would you do to formalize that? How do you think about that when you're thinking about, no matter where you are in Colorado, it's going to feel like you're in the middle of the densest market?
I call Jeff.
Good. Okay, got it. Did you get that, everyone? Jeff.craft@state.co.uk.
One of the things I think you're sort of asking us to wrestle with, or wrestling with, Stephanie, is there a role for technology to help link people together? And I'm the wrong person to answer that question, because I'm a little bit of a slow technology adopter. But I'll say one thing, which is, this is maybe skeptical, but I remember in the 1990s when a telecommunications economist wrote the book The Death of Distance, and basically long distance was free and it was frictionless and people could live everywhere and work everywhere. And since then we've had this massive
urban concentration.
Yeah, urban concentration, agglomeration boom, and increasing returns to density and concentration. And they've been complaining in the Bay Area how expensive it is for 30 years, but now it's really untouchable for so many people. So technology hasn't been the panacea, but I know we're trying to figure out how it can be one tool that's a solution, because clearly it brings people of affinity together. And one of the planners, Delaney Keating here with Startup Colorado, is sort of wrestling with this very question. I know as they're trying to enable and build networks, how do you use technology, and how can you leverage existing platforms and tools to provide those linkages? And is that enough? If you can help people connect online, can you then foster a mentoring relationship, perhaps via phone and maybe with a little bit of an in-person meeting? And how do you try that? And how do you kind of glue that together and see if it works? Right. Because it's got incredible potential. Like, you don't want to just dismiss the idea, because the idea of connecting powerful people in the food network in Boulder to parts of the Western Slope could be incredible.
The challenge, Jeff, that I've observed, and Sarah, I don't know if you had a similar kind of outlook. One of the reasons a lot of people move to rural Colorado is to get away from technology. Yeah. And so when we're working with, especially in Northeast Colorado, when we do our work in the Sterling area, farming, ranching area, et cetera, I mean, what is this cell phone thing? Kind of, not that they don't want to embrace technology, they don't understand it, or et cetera, not at all, but it's that sense, that correlation. I think it could just be kind of a lack of education as a foundation, but that correlation of technology means I'm being sucked back into that urban corridor kind of feel, right? The reason I'm on a ranch and I want to be away from the Facebooks and the Twitter and the Instagram. And so that's been kind of an interesting challenge. When we have over 400 people that have taken our classes over the last 5 years, and we've tried, and we're working with Delaney and trying to figure out how do we build community and technology, and it's been a real challenge. Yeah. We have not cracked the code by any stretch of the imagination, and there's still a lot of work to be done, but it's it's interesting to think about.
Yeah, I'm not sure about technology, but you asked a question, Stephanie. Is it really possible to have this urban-rural collaboration? And I do think it's possible. I know it's possible. I've seen it happen.
You're part of it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's only because I didn't grow up in Grand Junction. It's not my hometown. I mean, now it is because I've been there 15 years, but I wasn't defensive. And I think when you're in one industry for a long time and you're 4 hours from any urban corridor, there's a certain amount of defensiveness and don't come in here and tell me what to do and don't treat me like a dumbass. I know I shouldn't say that on tape, but like don't treat me like I'm a redneck from rural Colorado. Like come in here, not with your big ideas, come in here to listen to me. Come in here to tell me what, to listen to me and tell me how you can help me. And so I think that intention needs to come, which I'm sure it does from everybody in this room, but I think that's one of the things that we've made a little bit of missteps on in the past.
Yeah. A reminder of the last story I told.
No, but it's also like some of that is like entrenched, and then you say, well, you don't want my help. I'm here to help you, and if you don't want my help, then we're gonna go to another community that wants help. I mean, there's a certain amount of responsibility a rural community has to take for its own sort of defensive behavior, but it's just working on that and having champions that are like, the OEdit is great, instead of somebody that's like, OEdit is, just another government bureaucracy.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think, so I'll end the question. I don't know what our timing is, so, we have 10 minutes left, okay. 15, okay.
Oh, Q&A.
Shoot,
Q&A,
so I'll open it up for questions in a second, but one last thing I would say is, or I guess question I would ask is, when we think of rural urban, the reason I ask that question is, are we trying to aspire to something that may happen opportunistically but won't happen systemically? Should we be thinking about our rural communities more regionally? Should we be thinking about them more as kind of hubs that kind of defrag and create density for themselves across multiple communities first? And then does that create a power base that then can connect to the next kind of hub? Is that the approach we should be taking? I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
That is what has worked for us.
Okay.
Really making a partnership and not saying, Fruta, you have to be like us, or Palisade, you have to be like the three communities were really having a good partnership, and knowing that'll trickle over to communities like, DeBeck and Rifle and Parachute. I mean, all of that.
Even down into Montrose.
Yeah.
And this is what the Waldens are trying to do in Bentonville. They're basically saying, the regional community is the heartland of America. They're just saying, hey, we're going to be a regional community, and we're going to, whether it's workforce development, investment capital, IP, whatever it is, we're going to try to focus that on these, these 5 or 6 or 7 surrounding states around Arkansas. So whether it's Durango, to Junction, Uray, or it's a county or statewide initiative, I think there is a regional play, and it may not be towards Denver for Grand Junction. It may be towards Salt Lake, or maybe south to Durango.
Right.
And I would add, I think one thing we've learned directly is to even sub-segment rural Colorado into other communities, right? So we tend to bundle the Western Slope is the Western Slope. Well, within that, there are pioneer communities, right? The term we're using that are even, in a different stage in their development. So step one we've learned in terms of, kind of creating these bridges is to meet these communities kind of where they're at and listen and understand how can we then understand the community and then create bridges to other communities rather than lumping 15 smaller communities all together. What can we do to understand even within that? What are the nuances and how can we create bridges? But I think it's super important that we think of ways to create that density, create those bridges. It's something that we have failed miserably at, quite frankly, in our workshop series, because we're trying to go into different communities within a region, but people are like, well, I'm not going 20 minutes away. I mean, if you come here, I'll come to your workshop, but I'm not going to drive 20 minutes down the road. It's like, really? So we're learning about that. Well,
Not to learn, they would drink. I mean, if you say there's beer there, they may come.
Well, that's a good point. We're wrong incentive structures,
Well,
Stephanie.
that was our strategy, right?
Got to get the right
seriously.
incentive structure.
Right. All right. So I want to open it up to questions. Students first. Come on, go for it. Thanks, Brad.
Thanks. So Colorado Sun somewhat recently ran a piece that was looking at communities that have transitioned from extraction-based economies to recreation-based economies. I think it was like really focusing on Salida, and was looking at some of the downsides of that. So like, you know, recreation-based jobs maybe have lower wages, increased cost of living, more traffic, more second homeowners. Sarah, I'm curious just how Grand Junction is kind of thinking about those tensions and maybe trying to plan for them.
Yeah, I mean, when you say recreation-based economy, I think you're talking about tourism and not recreation-based economy. When we talk about recreation and outdoor recreation-based economy, we're talking about building the access and infrastructure in the recreation space so that people want to move their businesses there. So for us, it means building more trails. It means building a whitewater park. It means building a paved path from Palisade all the way to the Cocopelli trails in Loma. It means having more Nordic ski trails on the Mesa. It means having infrastructure and trails so that your tech company wants to relocate there or wants to stay there after they've grown. So that's what that means for us. Our coalition is made up of companies like mine. I'm an outdoor recreation manufacturer. I pay 140% of the average wage in Mesa County, so definitely not low-paying jobs. Even our entry-level employees do pretty well. There's manufacturers like MRP, Leitner Poma, DT Swiss in our town, but then there's also service providers like guiding companies, the ski resort. Sure, some of the lifties are making minimum wage, but that's not overwhelmingly what the recreation industry represents. And I think a lot of people get recreation and tourism mixed up, and that Colorado Sun article did. So
wait, I would add to that. Sarah is right in that Grand Junction has made recreation an amenity of placemaking that has then attracted the next phase of industry for recreation and or other industry that will then propel a community forward. What has to happen in any community, the first thing is you have to have people that want to come there, then you have people that want to stay there, and then you have to have infrastructure that supports them staying there to work and play and live. And for example, in Salida and other places, their next step should be to think about how they're going to leverage the population that has their attention on them. That's the next step. The first phase is better than the last, and the next phase has to be better than that.
yeah, to be clear, we're not trying to take Grand Junction from extracted fossil fuels and put all their eggs were in that basket for 100 years or 80 years. We're not trying to take all those eggs and put them in tourism. That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to create a place and really leverage the 74% of our county that's public lands and create quality of life for people that want to relocate, grow businesses, raise families, young people.
By the way, last thing on that, sorry, Paul, they're expanding the airport. The school levy was passed. There are infrastructure elements around this that then become symbiotic with the people moving in. That doesn't happen by accident. That has to be a very planned thing. And I think that, again, the rural economies think about this a lot, or they should be thinking about this a lot. How do you diversify, and then how do you plan for growth such that you have a place where people can actually, it's not such a leap to go from a place where you can get to any country in the world airport to a more regional, to a more remote place. You have to have some, if you really want to grow, Palisades does not, right?
Well,
but I mean, you know what I mean.
They want to grow, but in their own way.
They don't want to have 5 runways.
They don't want to have a Walmart in the middle of town.
Right.
Or any chain, for that matter.
Paul, sorry, I didn't.
No, I was just going to say the article got some things right and some things wrong. Moab is a case study in a extractive, based economy that transitioned over 40 years. It was a uranium mining community. Then it was a Superfund site, and then they discovered mountain biking and jeeping. So Moab has become this mecca for tourism. And the argument, which is reality, which is true, is if you're a coal miner, you're making $100,000 a year. This is an unskilled job. The fact is the economy has moved. The economy of energy has moved away from that industry. And the fact is those jobs are going away. There is no argument that we've got to go find something else. There's no argument that miner is going to have a hard time, if not impossible, to find a $100,000 job to replace that. But the essence of this conversation, that we're having this afternoon is that person with a skill set could be an entrepreneur, and they could eventually start and own a business that could be making 2x 100,000. But they've got to do like Sarah and some other entrepreneurs. You got to start this from the ground up. So instead of getting a paycheck for being a miner, you have to become an entrepreneur, which is a very different animal. So I think it's sort of your question sort of goes to the heart of why we're talking about this. This is not, sort of a like to have or a casual conversation about what happened to rural America. We've got this huge economic shift in America. And the reality is either we're going to move a lot of people into the ability to be entrepreneurs, create products and services they can sell to other people, or they're frankly going to be left behind in the economy.
I would just add, I think Sarah's conversation was really tied together some interesting themes, and she touched on, communities that are going to be successful, and Stephanie was alluding to this, have to have a willingness to invest in themselves through multiple mechanisms, whatever those are, like building out a riverfront park and cleaning up, old tailings. So that investment in the community, a collective investment, and also, and I think Sarah, you also alluded to this, it's not going to be a solely outdoor rec industry. There's a sense of how do you diversify the economy. And if you really do look at what happened in Denver, the city of Denver itself from the 80s, I mean, it was an extractive-based economy. It was office buildings full of paper pushers that weren't doing the extraction, but they were managing that process, and that industry went away, it shrank, and it moved back to Houston, and Denver was devastated. And it's been a 30 to 40-year process of diversifying that economy. So that economic diversification and the willingness to invest, even when times are tough, in yourself, I think can be really powerful lights. And that, I think Grand Junction is really sort of finding its footing in both of those areas.
Thanks.
Just sort of a two-part question. Trust and accountability. Things are happening with infrastructure. I think of RTD, things are making the news today. They're shutting down lines because they can't get drivers and those kind of things. How much CDOT study's been about I-70 corridor expansion, and taking those dollars, making sure they're being used for the the propers. How do you balance accountability? Then people are making these policy decisions, allocation of resources, but also the intended use for those resources, and how we build that trust that we're doing the right thing in the long term.
Are you asking how do we build trust between the government and the public sector?
You're right, yeah, with some of these things that are going on.
So that I'm qualified to I don't work.
Jeff.
Yeah, go for it, Jeff.
I mean, I don't know that there's a single easy answer, obviously, to that question. It's a really profound and important question. I would say, it's a messy process of lots of different stakeholders trying to work through policies and processes, and electing your elected officials and setting your priorities, and voting out the officials that aren't getting things done in an effective way, and working through that public citizen accountability process. Like, there's no shortcuts, and you have to work within all the legal structures and confines that we have here, whether it's Tabor or those other things that sort of limit what we can do. But yeah, it's tough. I mean, RTD is an elected board. To take that example really specifically, it's an elected board. They did some great, powerful, positive investments that have really helped the economy. But I myself am a Boulder resident, and in northern part of the metro area, and obviously some of the things that were supposed to come to fruition here did not come to fruition. And so if you're a Boulder or Longmont or a Louisville person and you didn't get the investment that you thought you were getting, it's a tough situation, and you're just one small voice in a large region, and that voice can sometimes be ignored, and it takes time to work through that challenge.
I would just say one thing, just to piggyback on that. When we first started sort of working on changing the narrative in the community, people would say to me, well, don't have coffee with her, that county commissioner, or that county treasurer, or that city council member. They're crazy. They're not gonna They're not going to listen to you. They're going to think you're stupid. And I would say that the majority of the time, those face-to-face conversations had really great outcomes. There were some times that you're like, I have no idea how that person got into elected office because they cannot even form a sentence. But that was a small amount. And so I do feel like we've lost that a little bit in this country, especially over the last few years. It's easy to complain about something and then get everybody riled up about it. And it's harder to have a face-to-face conversation with somebody that you may not see eye to eye. I don't know. You guys know all this. I have had good experiences.
Hitting it head on.
Yeah.
Just hitting it head on.
Yeah, just hitting it head on. Like, I'm just going to call my county commissioner who totally disagrees with me in pretty much everything, but we're going to try to get to an agreement on this.
Yeah.
You know, to your question, it's actually a bigger problem locally, because the stakes are a lot more complicated now for local governments, whether it's a county commissioner or a town council or mayor or manager. I mean, it used to be we had these extractive industries, right? And the money would come and go based on global commodity prices. Now we're talking about entrepreneurship, and these local governing people are, you know, they don't know what is this thing. They have no idea what their role is. And so, well, I don't see it as an accountability issue. I think it more as just a basic, you know, education issue, because their typical approach is, you know, when they talk about economic development, it's about recruiting a business to relocate. That is not what we're talking about. We're trying to get local businesses to start and grow, versus trying to, you know, steal somebody else's business. So it's not an accountability issue, it's more just a lack of education and sophistication.
Can we take one more? One more question back here, and then we're gonna.
So I wanted to speak to that gentleman's comment, because that's a big piece of this, taking RTD as an example. When you're an average Joe citizen and you show up to have a civil, polite conversation with your elected officials, they arrest you and you end up in jail. And that's happened more than once in RTD, and it's happened to more than one person at RTD. So when you're talking about vote for your elected official, I don't know which one of you said that. Many of us do that. And then when you do the follow-up that you should be doing to show up at the public meetings and have a dialogue and a discussion about things that are tragically wrong, that you've put in time to, you know, be able to speak about it, public comment, you get arrested. So transparency and accountability doesn't exist, and you are going to have to tackle that. And to tie into that, as far as the capital that you're talking about, where is capital directly to the entrepreneurs? Because people like me have some great ideas and we're interested in entrepreneuring. We have no interest in you as a middleman, as the government, right?
None of us, by the way, the only person that works for the government here is right here.
Well, aren't you from the
the
Office of Economic Development, didn't you say?
I did for 2 years, but I was in the private sector. I don't anymore.
We just need less government involved, and this is coming from somebody who is not anti-government and who knows tragically why we need less government involved, as that gentleman in the gray suit alluded to much more articulately than me. So can you speak to how you're not trying to link government and business to grow entrepreneurship, and how we get the people with the capital, you know, who want the mentors?
So let me just well, I think this is a little off track in contextually, but a couple things. One is there are many sources of capital for entrepreneurs. If you've started a business before, you know how, as a founder and raising money, you know how difficult it is, and you know how you have so many forms of capital that exist. You have debt, right? And depending on where you sit from a business standpoint, you may or may not have access to traditional financing. You have equity that can come in various forms: seed capital, friends and family, institutional capital, et cetera. And that capital is also very difficult to get, and it has ramifications for what you want. By the way, I run a fund. We probably have a number of investors in the room as well. You have also government sources of capital that are high risk takers, that probably have if you don't want them in, they probably have the highest tolerance for risk that is the best for some early stage prototyping companies like the advanced industries. When you're trying to develop a bioscience tool and you have, or bioscience product, and you have a 10-year life cycle in that development, there are not a lot, if you're especially your first timer, there's not a lot of people that will take risk on that. So government does put programs in place to help facilitate that gap, and that is free. But let me just finish. I guess I don't, I'm sorry, I guess I don't understand the point. What you said is that you want to entrepreneur, you want to start businesses, you want to found. You don't have to. You don't have to. We're all totally fine with that. We're all fine with that.
Just as a business owner who started a business from nothing out of my basement, we got to a point where we had a deficiency from like clients paying us, and then there was a gap there. You know, we didn't have any capital, right? We didn't start with any capital other than like a 15-passenger van. And we just went to the bank and got a really small line of credit to start, and that really helped. And the government was not involved. It wasn't an SBA or anything. It was just like this little line of credit. So I would say start with your local bank. Start with a local bank. Sorry, all those national banks, but the local banks will really help you. And so that's what I would recommend.
This is a nice preview of the third panel, which is going to be kicked off with a mini keynote. It's going to look at a really innovative approach to banking entrepreneurs in rural areas. So we're going to be going in that direction. I also want to say, before I ask you to help me thank this panel, man, there's some conferences where I have it doesn't change my thinking about an issue, but you guys have really helped provide nuance in a way that I've just found this so informative. Great discussion. Please help me give a warm thank you to the panelists. That's great. Okay, we've got a 10-minute break. We're going to shorten it up 10 minutes. We'll be back at 10 till the hour, and we'll do a panel 3.